The West doesn't forgive. It starves you, breaks you, and leaves you with nothing but your pride. Nora Callahan had nothing left, except that pride. But when a drifter named Colt steps into her world, bringing food she refuses and truths she can't ignore, something begins to crack. Out here, survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about deciding what you're willing to lose to keep going. If you felt the weight of this story, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more.
The flour barrel was empty. Not just low, empty. Nora Callahan scraped her fingernails against the dry wooden bottom. A fine white dust coated her knuckles. It was barely enough to shape into two thin, pitiful biscuits. One for Luke, one for little Addie. The hearth fire was dying. Just a handful of embers fighting the West Texas morning chill. It was 1878, and out here the wind didn't care if you were cold. Nora wiped her hands on her faded apron. Her stomach didn't growl anymore. That was the funny thing about hunger. Day 1, it clawed at you. Day 2, it made you dizzy. By day 3, it was just a cold, hollow ghost living under your ribs. This was day 3. She hadn't eaten a crumb, not a single drop of broth. Not because she was busy, because she had done the math. The bank owned the roof over her head. The drought owned the dirt. And the neighbors? They didn't look kindly on a former Union field nurse who'd brought a Southern boy back home, only to watch him put a gun to his own head. Or so she believed. The church called it an unforgivable sin. Nora called it her punishment. So, she isolated herself. She starved, quietly. Because in Texas, pride was often the only thing you had left when the money ran out. Outside, the sun crested the plains, baking the earth into cracked leather. Nora stepped onto the porch. Her breath caught. The western fence. The rotting wood gave out with a sickening snap. 3 head of emaciated cattle lumbered over the broken rails, making a break for the open plains. Nora ran. Her boots kicked up dust, but she was weak. Too weak. Then a shadow fell across the dirt, a man on a tired roan horse. He didn't shout, he didn't ask permission, he just stepped down from his saddle. He was tall, his shoulders broad under a dust-caked coat. He looked like a man who had left his peace of mind 1,000 miles behind him. He moved with quiet purpose, grabbed a stray post, shoved it deep into the hard earth. He waved his hat, turning the cattle back into the pen. Took him 10 minutes. 10 minutes of silent, heavy work. Nora reached the fence, her chest heaving. She wiped her brow. She didn't say thank you, she just looked at him, her chin tilted up. "I didn't ask for your help, mister. I can manage my own land." The drifter looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the pale skin, the trembling hands. He didn't argue. He just tipped his hat, walked his horse to the water trough, and waited. Evening fell. The wind howled. Nora sat alone at the kitchen table. The kids were asleep in the back room. The house was dead quiet. The front door opened. The cowboy walked in. He didn't knock. He carried a heavy canvas sack over his shoulder. He dropped it right on Nora's kitchen table. A solid thud. Nora jumped. "What do you think you're doing in my house?" He didn't answer right away. He untied the sack, pulled out a thick slab of salt pork, a fresh, heavy bag of town flour. He walked over to her dying hearth, tossed in a log from the corner, and struck a match. "I'm cooking," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "Name's Colt Wilder." Nora stood up. Her legs shook, but her voice was sharp. "You take that back out of here. I am not a beggar. I don't need your charity. We are doing just fine." Colt stopped. He turned around. He looked at the empty flour barrel. He looked at her sunken cheeks. Then he spoke, deliberately, making sure every word landed heavy and true. "Ma'am, a mother's honor isn't found in an empty stomach." Nora froze. "It's found in having the grit to let the world lend a hand when it's already taken too much from you," Colt continued. His eyes locked steady on hers. "Human decency isn't charity. It's the rightful claim of good people. Tucking your pride away to feed yourself so you can stay alive for your children. That makes you strong, not weak." He pulled out a wooden chair. The legs scraped against the floorboards. "You've been carrying the world alone," he said softly. "Set it down for one night." He sat down at her table. He looked at the fire, he looked at the food, and he made it clear, without saying another word, that he was not going to leave. Nora stood there. For the first time in 3 days, the hollow ghost in her chest felt warm. She pulled out a chair, and she sat down too. Morning came early to West Texas. It always did. The sun didn't rise so much as it bled across the horizon. A harsh, scraped raw kind of light. It found the cracks in the barnwood. It found Colt Wilder sleeping in the hayloft. He woke with a start. His hand dropped to his side. Instinct. Looking for a cavalry saber that hadn't been there in years. He breathed out. Slow. The dust motes danced in the light. His back ached. His knees popped. The damp cold of the Montana winters still lived in his bones, even down here in the desert. He sat up, brushed the straw from his wool coat. He didn't think about yesterday. He didn't think about tomorrow. That was how you survived. You just looked at the thing right in front of you. Right now, the thing in front of him was work. He climbed down the wooden ladder. The rungs groaned. Out in the yard, the air was sharp, biting. The wind whipped off the plains, carrying the smell of sagebrush and dried dirt. He walked to the water well. He'd seen it the day before. The wooden crank was shattered, split clean down the middle from years of dry rot and desperate pulling. A woman's hands couldn't pull a full bucket up 40 feet of rope without a crank. Not for long, anyway. Colt walked to his horse, dug into his saddlebags. He pulled out a draw knife and a heavy iron rasp. He found a piece of cured hickory out by the woodpile. Hard wood. Good wood. He sat on an overturned barrel and went to work. The shavings curled. They fell to the dirt like snowflakes. The rhythm was steady. Scrape, shave, scrape, shave. A man could lose himself in work like this. A man could forget his own name if he worked hard enough. Inside the farmhouse, Nora opened her eyes. She stared at the ceiling, the water stains, the peeling paint. She waited for the hunger to hit her, the hollow ache that had been her morning companion for 3 days. It wasn't there. Instead, there was a heavy warmth in her belly, meat, flour, real food. The memory of last night came rushing back. The stranger, the meal, the way he had just sat there taking up space in a house that had felt so empty for 14 months. Nora sat up. She threw her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet hit the cold floorboards. She didn't feel weak today. She felt anchored. She walked into the kitchen. The hearth was cold, but the smell of wood smoke and salt pork lingered. She looked out the window. There he was, sitting by the well, working a piece of wood. He didn't look up, he didn't ask for coffee. He was just doing what needed to be done. Nora felt a pull in her chest, a tightening. It was a dangerous thing, letting a man do your work. In this world, a favor was a debt, and debts were paid in blood or sweat, or worse. But looking at him, the way his hands moved over the wood, she didn't see a man looking to collect. She just saw a man working. She heard a floorboard creak. Addie stood in the doorway, her nightgown dragged on the floor. She held a rag doll by one arm. Her hair was a wild tangle of blonde curls. "Mama?" she whispered. "I'm here, sweet bug," Nora said softly. Addie walked over. She rubbed her eyes. She looked out the window. She saw the big man in the dusty coat. "Is he still here?" Addie asked. "Looks like it. Why?" Addie looked up at her mother. Her blue eyes were wide, innocent, but living on the frontier aged a child fast. She knew enough to know that strangers didn't stay without a reason. "Mrs. Gable in town says a house without a man is a broken thing. She says women can't fix things. Is that why he's here, because we're broken?" Nora stiffened, her jaw set. The old union nurse in her, the woman who had sawn off shattered limbs and stitched up torn men while cannon fire shook the earth, rose up in her throat. She hated that talk, hated the way this harsh country tried to make women feel small. She knelt down. She took Addie by the shoulders. She made sure she was at eye level. This was important. This mattered more than the well or the cattle or the bank. "Listen to me, Addie," Nora said. Her voice was steady. It wasn't angry, but it left no room for argument. Folks out here will tell you a woman was born to lean on a man. They will tell you we are weak, but that's a lie. Addie blinked. It is? Yes, it is, Nora said, squeezing her daughter's shoulders gently. We aren't taking Mr. Colt's help because we're weak women. We're taking it because human beings were made to hold each other up as equals. Nobody stands taller than anybody else when the hard times come. Nora paused, making sure the words sank in. A man isn't better than a woman. A woman isn't less than a man. We are just people, and when a person falls, another person reaches down a hand. Not because they are the master, but because they are human. Do you understand me? Addie stared. Then, slowly, she nodded. He's just reaching down a hand. That's right, Nora said. She stood back up. She smoothed Addie's hair. Now, go wash your face. I'm going to make some biscuits. Outside, Colt finished the crank. He slid it into the iron housing of the well. He tapped it in place with the flat of his hand. It fit tight. Perfect. He grabbed the handle and turned. The rope went down. It hit the water. He pulled it up. The bucket broke the surface, heavy and full. He didn't spill a drop. You did that wrong. Colt turned. Luke was standing there. 14 years old. Skinny as a rail, but with eyes that were too old for his face. He was holding a rusted pitchfork. He looked at the well. Then he looked at Colt. How's that? Colt asked. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't get defensive. He just asked. My pa used oak, Luke said. His chin was jutted out, guarding his territory, guarding the ghost of his father. Oak is stronger. Colt looked at the piece of hickory. Then he looked at the boy. He understood. It wasn't about the wood, it was about the man who used to cut it. Oak is hard, Colt agreed. He leaned against the stone wall of the well. But oak snaps when the weather turns cold. It doesn't have any give. Hickory flexes. It bends a little before it breaks. Out here, sometimes you gotta bend a little. Luke narrowed his eyes. He walked over. He dropped the pitchfork. He put his hands on the new crank. He looked at Colt, testing him, waiting for the man to shoo him away, to tell him to let the adults handle it. Colt just stepped back. He crossed his arms. Give it a pull, Colt said. Luke gripped the handle. He planted his boots in the dirt. He pulled. His scrawny arms shook, but the crank turned, smooth, even. The heavy bucket rose up, bringing the sweet smell of deep earth water with it. Luke let go. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at the water. He didn't say thank you. He didn't know how to. It pulls even, Luke muttered. It does, Colt said. They stood there for a minute, the man and the boy. The wind blew a tumbleweed against the fence line. It was a quiet moment, a silent shifting of the ground beneath their feet. Breakfast is ready. Nora was standing on the porch. She was wearing a shawl over her shoulders. The wind whipped her hair across her face. Colt touched the brim of his hat. Luke grabbed the bucket of water. They walked toward the house together. The kitchen was warm, the fire was going, there were biscuits on the table, flaky, hot. There was a pot of coffee, black as pitch, sitting on the iron grate. Colt sat down. In the same chair he sat in last night. Luke sat across from him. Addie sat next to her mother. They passed the food. They didn't talk much. You didn't need to talk when you were eating food that might be your last for a while. You just respected it. You ate it slow. Nora watched him over the rim of her coffee cup. He didn't eat like a starving man. He ate deliberate, methodical, like a man fueling a machine. His hands were scarred, calloused. There was a white scar running over his left knuckle. A knife fight? A stray bullet? She didn't ask. He finished his coffee. He set the cup down, very gently. He looked at Nora. The western fence needs bracing, Colt said. Posts are rotted below the dirt line. I know, Nora said. I've been meaning to get to it. It's a two-person job, Colt stated. Not a question. A fact. Nora looked at her hands. The nails were chipped. The skin was cracked. She was tired, bone-tired, but she had pride. I can't pay you, she said softly. so the kids wouldn't hear the desperation. "I don't have coin. The bank—" She stopped. She didn't need to tell him about the bank. "Didn't ask for pay," Colt said. He pushed his chair back. He stood up. He put his hat on. "I asked if you wanted to fix the fence." Nora looked up at him, at the broad chest, the worn face, the eyes that had seen the devil and walked away. She stood up. She grabbed her leather work gloves from the counter. "Let's fix the fence," she said, and that was it. That was the vow. No paper signed, no hand shook, just an unspoken agreement that today the work would be done together. They walked out into the harsh Texas sun. Two people, broken but still breathing, walking side by side into the wind. The heat didn't just warm you, it pressed you. It put a heavy hand on your shoulders and tried to drive you into the dirt. That was Texas in the summer of 1878. A week had passed since Colt Wilder sat down at the table. 7 days, 168 hours of punishing, relentless labor. They didn't talk much. The work didn't leave breath for talking. They braced the western fence. They replaced the rotting timber on the barn doors. They hauled water. They chopped mesquite wood. They moved with a strange, unspoken rhythm. Colt would swing the axe, Nora would stack the wood, Nora would hold the wire tight, Colt would drive the staple. It was a dance of calluses and sweat, but hard work didn't pay the bank. Sweat didn't buy off Dale Garrett. "We need cash," Nora said. It was late afternoon. They were standing by the cattle pens. The wind was hot. It carried the smell of dry manure and dust. Inside the pen, 8 head of cattle stood in the shade. They were skinny, ribs showing through matted hair. But they were alive, and alive meant they had value. Colt leaned against the top rail. He rolled a cigarette, slow, deliberate. He struck a match on his boot heel and lit it. He took a drag. "Alpine?" he asked. The smoke drifted from his lips. "It's the only livestock market within 40 miles, Nora said. She pulled her hat down low to block the glare. "We sell these 8. We might have enough to make the interest payment. Keep Garrett off our backs for another month." "They're light," Colt observed, looking at the hollow flanks of the steers. "Buyer is going to try to gut the price." "I know," Nora said. Her voice was tight. "But it's all I've got." Colt flicked the cigarette away. He stood up straight. "Then we ride at dawn." The next morning, the sky was the color of a bruised plum, purple and dark red. They saddled the horses. Luke helped them push the 8 steers out of the pen. The boy wanted to come. Nora saw it in his eyes. But someone had to stay with Addie. Someone had to watch the house. "Keep the shotgun loaded," Nora told her son. She didn't hug him. You didn't do that when a boy was trying to be a man. You just looked him in the eye. "Don't open the door for anyone." "Yes, ma'am," Luke said. He stood tall, holding his pitchfork like a rifle. Colt swung up onto his roan. He whistled sharp, a piercing sound that cut through the morning air. The cattle stirred. They started to move. The drive to Alpine took 4 hours. It was brutal. The sun climbed higher, baking the earth. The dust kicked up by the hooves coated their mouths, their noses, their clothes. They rode in silence. Just the creak of saddle leather, the jingle of spurs, and the lowing of thirsty cows. Nora rode well. She sat deep in the saddle. She handled the reins with a light touch. Colt watched her from the corner of his eye. She wasn't some delicate flower. She was iron-forged in a fire she never asked for. By mid-morning, the town of Alpine appeared on the horizon. It wasn't much to look at. A collection of wooden buildings clustered around a rail spur. False front stores, saloons, a bank, and the stockyards. The smell hit them first. A thick, pungent odor of unwashed bodies, whiskey, and animal filth. They pushed the small herd down the main street. Wagons rattled past. Cowboys lounged on wooden boardwalks, chewing tobacco and watching them pass. Their eyes lingered on Nora. It wasn't often you saw a woman driving cattle on the frontier. The looks weren't kind. They were full of judgment, of quiet mockery. Nora kept her eyes straight ahead. She didn't flinch. They reached the holding pens. Colt dismounted and opened the gate. Nora drove the 8 steers inside. "Wait here," Colt said. "I'll fetch the buyer." Nora stayed in the saddle. She watched the cattle mill around the pen. Her heart was beating fast. This was it. This was the lifeline. If the price was too low, the bank would take the house. It was just math. Cruel, uncaring math. A few minutes later, Colt returned. He wasn't alone. He was walking beside a man in a pinstripe suit. The suit was dusty, but it was expensive. The man wore a bowler hat and carried a silver-tipped walking stick. His belly pushed against his waistcoat. He was sweating heavily. This was Higgins, the primary buyer for the Northern Rail lines. Higgins walked up to the pen. He didn't look at Colt. He looked at the cattle. Then he looked up at Nora. He smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well now," Higgins drawled. His voice was oily, like bad grease. "What do we have here? A little lady playing rancher?" Nora gripped the reins tighter. Her knuckles went white. "I'm Mrs. Callahan. These are my steers. 8 head. Survived the winter and the drought. I'm looking to sell." Higgins laughed, a wet, wheezing sound. He leaned his walking stick against the fence. He looked at the cows again, shook his head. "They're bags of bones, little lady," Higgins said dismissively. "They ain't got no fat on 'em. Meat'll be tough as shoe leather." "They're healthy," Nora shot back. Her voice was sharp. "They just need grain. You buy them, load them on the rail car, and by the time they hit Chicago, they'll fatten up. You know that. I know that. Don't play games." Higgins' smile vanished. He didn't like being talked back to, especially not by a woman. He looked at her with cold, calculating eyes. "Listen to me, Mrs. Callahan," Higgins said, his voice dropping low. "I know who you are. I know your husband blew his brains out because he couldn't handle the debt." Nora flinched as if she'd been struck. Higgins pressed his advantage. "You got no man to vouch for these animals. You got no backing. You're a desperate widow miles from nowhere. I'll give you $10 a head. That's $80 total. Take it and go buy yourself a train ticket back east where you belong." $80. It was an insult. A robbery. Fair market value, even for light steers, was $20 a head. $80 wouldn't even cover half the interest she owed the bank. It was a death sentence for the ranch. Nora opened her mouth to argue. Her chest was tight with rage and panic. But before she could speak, Colt stepped forward. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He just moved in between Higgins and the fence, blocking the buyer's view of Nora. Colt stood tall. His thumbs were hooked into his gun belt, right near the heavy buckle. His coat was pushed back. The handle of his Colt revolver was visible. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. The implication was enough. Higgins took a step back. His eyes darted to the gun, then up to Colt's scarred face. "Now see here," Higgins stammered. "I'm doing business with the lady." "You ain't doing business," Colt said. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. But it carried over the noise of the stockyard like a rifle crack. "You're trying to pick the pockets of a grieving woman." "It's a free market," Higgins argued, though he was sweating harder now. "She's a woman. She can't negotiate terms like a man." Colt didn't move. He stared at Higgins. His eyes were like chipped ice. "You listen to me, Higgins," Colt said. Every word was deliberate. Every syllable carried the weight of absolute conviction. "The laws of America might not have written down a woman's rights out here on the frontier just yet," Colt said, his voice rising just enough for the cowboys nearby to hear. "But the good Lord's laws sure did." Higgins swallowed hard. "Cheating a lone mother out of her sweat doesn't make you a smart businessman," Colt continued, taking one slow step forward. "It makes you a cheap thief. She is the legal owner of this land. She worked these cows. She drove them here. You pay a fair wage for human labor. I don't care if the hands that did the work belong to a man or a woman." Silence fell over the immediate area. A few cowboys who had been laughing earlier suddenly found something very interesting to look at on the ground. Colt leaned in closer. "Now, you are going to look at the lady, and you are going to offer her $20 a head, because that is the fair price. And you are a fair man, aren't you, Mr. Higgins?" It wasn't a question. It was an order, delivered by a man who had killed men for less. Higgins looked at the gun. He looked at Colt's eyes. He realized very suddenly that if he pushed this, he might not walk away. Higgins cleared his throat. He pulled out a silk handkerchief and wiped his brow. He looked past Colt, up at Nora. $20 a head, Higgins squeaked out. $160, cash on the barrelhead. Nora sat in the saddle. She didn't smile. She didn't look relieved. She looked like a queen accepting her due. "I'll take it," Nora said flatly. Higgins reached into his coat pocket. His hands were shaking. He counted out the bills. Greenbacks, stiff and dirty. He handed them to Colt. Colt didn't count them. He just handed them up to Nora. Nora folded the money. She tucked it into her shirt pocket, right over her heart. "Pleasure doing business," Colt said to Higgins. Higgins didn't reply. He grabbed his walking stick and scurried away toward the rail cars, barking orders at his men to hide his humiliation. Colt turned back to his horse. He swung up into the saddle. They rode out of Alpine as the sun began to set. The ride home was different. The heat broke, giving way to the sudden, shocking chill of the desert night. The sky exploded with stars, millions of them, cold and bright. They didn't push the horses. They just let them walk. Nora rode beside Colt. The wind tugged at her hat. She reached up and touched her pocket. The money was there. It was real. They had bought another month. She looked at Colt in the dim light. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. Colt kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Do what?" "Step in. Draw his fire." Nora paused. "I could have handled him." "I know you could," Colt said. "I didn't step in because you couldn't handle it. I stepped in because you shouldn't have to." Nora let those words hang in the air. You shouldn't have to. No one had said that to her in a very long time. Since James died, she had to do everything. She had to be the man, the woman, the father, the mother, the shield, and the sword. It was exhausting. It was a burden that was grinding her down into dust. "Thank you," she finally said. And this time she meant it. Completely. Colt just nodded. He didn't make a big deal out of it. He didn't ask for a reward. He didn't preen like a rooster. "He was trying to make you small," Colt said softly, looking up at the stars. "I don't abide men who try to make other folks small so they can feel big. It ain't right." Nora smiled. Just a little. The ghost in her chest was gone entirely now. "No," she agreed. "It ain't right." They rode the rest of the way in silence. But it wasn't the heavy, guarded silence of two strangers. It was the comfortable, steady silence of two people walking the same hard road. When they finally saw the dark shape of the farmhouse on the horizon, the single lantern burning in the window looked like a beacon. They had survived the day. They had won a small victory. Tomorrow the sun would rise again. The work would start over. The bank would still be waiting. But tonight, as they rode into the yard side by side, Nora Callahan realized something terrifying and beautiful. She wasn't fighting alone anymore. The porch boards creaked, an old, tired sound. It was late, the kind of late where the wind finally stops fighting the dirt and just settles down. The children were asleep. The cattle from Alpine were gone, traded for a thin stack of greenbacks that now sat in a tin box on the kitchen counter. $80. It bought them time. It didn't buy them freedom. Nora sat in the rocking chair. She had a quilt pulled tight over her shoulders. The Texas night had a way of turning cold real fast, stealing the heat right out of your bones. Colt sat on the top step. His back rested against the wooden post. He had a hurricane lantern set on the floorboards between them. The flame flickered. It cast long, dancing shadows across his face. He was rolling a cigarette. His hands moved slow, deliberate. The tobacco went into the paper. The paper rolled tight. A quick flick of the tongue. He struck a match against the porch rail. The flare lit up his eyes. They were tired eyes. He took a drag. The tip glowed bright orange in the dark. He blew the smoke out into the cold air. "You did good today," Colt said. His voice was a low rumble. "We did good," Nora corrected him. Colt just nodded. He didn't argue. He took another drag. He looked out at the dark horizon. Out there, past the fence line, there was nothing but miles of black prairie. "It's quiet out here," Colt said. "Too quiet sometimes," Nora murmured. "Leaves too much room for thinking." Colt let out a short, breathy laugh. It didn't have much humor in it. "Thinking is a dangerous habit, especially in the dark." Nora watched him. She saw the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was looking. She saw the heavy weight he carried. It was a weight she recognized. She carried one just like it. "Where did you learn to shoot a man and look like you did to Higgins today?" Nora asked. Colt tapped the ash from his cigarette. "I was in the cavalry, up north. Spent 4 years looking at men through the sights of a rifle. You learn to look right through a fella, see what he's made of." Nora shifted in her chair. The rocking stopped. "The war." "The war," Colt agreed. It was a heavy word, a dirty word. He didn't say anything for a long time. The crickets chirped down in the dry grass. "I had a place," Colt said suddenly. His voice was softer now, almost fragile. "Up in Montana, near the Yellowstone River. Good grass, deep water. It was green, real green." Nora didn't interrupt. She just pulled the quilt a little tighter. "Had a wife. Sandra. A boy, too. Tommy." Colt swallowed hard. The lantern light caught a shine in his eye. "I came back from the fighting, but I didn't really come back. Part of me stayed out there in the mud, the bloody part." He took a deep breath, a shaky one. "I couldn't sleep. I couldn't be quiet. Every time a door slammed, I reached for a gun. So I found a bottle. The whiskey made the noise stop. For a little while." Colt looked down at his hands. "But a man can't drink away his ghosts, Nora. He just ends up making new ones." He looked at her. Stripped bare. No pride. No armor. "I lost the land. The bank took it. Sandra packed up Tommy and went to her sister's. She didn't leave because she stopped loving me. She left because I was a drowning man and I was pulling them under with me." Nora felt a lump form in her throat. She understood. Lord, she understood. "I haven't seen them in 5 years, Colt whispered. He tossed the cigarette stub into the dirt. "I ride, I work, I sleep, that's it. That's the whole story." Nora looked at him, at the broken pieces of a good man. She leaned forward in her rocking chair. She needed him to hear this. She needed to say the words out loud, not just for him, but for herself. "Listen to me, Colt," Nora said. Her voice was steady. It cut through the cold night air. "Folks out here, the men out here, they think silence makes a man strong. They think hiding the pain and bearing the trauma is what makes a man a man." Colt looked down. "Look at me," Nora commanded softly. He raised his eyes. "That silence," Nora said, her words deliberate and clear, "is exactly what kills a family. It's a poison. True courage isn't swallowing your pain until it rots you from the inside out. True courage is speaking it out loud. It's looking at the people you love and saying, 'I am hurt and I need help.'" She paused, letting the wind carry the words. "You didn't lose your family because you were broken," Nora continued. "You lost them because this world taught you that asking for help was a weakness. But it's not. Speaking your truth, sharing your pain, that is the only way a human soul can heal. We aren't meant to carry our horrors alone." Colt stared at her. His chest rose and fell, a ragged breath. "James!" Nora's voice finally cracked. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. "My James. He believed the same lie you did. He thought he had to carry the debt, the drought, the fear, all by himself. He thought letting me see him scared made him less of a husband. A tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "If he had just talked to me," Nora whispered. "If he had just let me help him carry it, he might still be sitting on this porch." Colt moved. He didn't say a word. He just stood up from the step. He walked over to her rocking chair. He reached out with a rough, calloused hand. And he gently wiped the tear from her face. His thumb was warm. His touch was incredibly soft for a man who had seen so much violence. "I'm sorry, Nora," he said. And he meant it. For James. For her. For the whole broken world. "I'm sorry for your Tommy, too," she replied. They stayed there like that for a moment, not touching anymore, just standing close. Two battered ships anchored in the same dark harbor. The walls were gone. The cotton clothes they wore couldn't hide the scars underneath anymore. But for the first time in a long time, the scars didn't throb. They just existed. "Get some sleep, Nora," Colt said softly. He picked up the lantern. He walked off the porch, heading toward the barn. Nora sat in the dark for a few minutes more. She looked up at the stars. They looked a little brighter tonight, a little less cold. She pulled the quilt around her, stood up, and went inside. She locked the door. But for the first time in 14 months, she didn't feel like she was locking out the world. She felt like she was safe. 2 days later, the dust rose on the eastern road. It wasn't a rider. It was a carriage. A sleek black buggy pulled by 2 matching bays. The wheels had iron rims that cut deep, sharp tracks into the dry Texas dirt. It moved fast. It moved with authority. Colt was out by the windmill, greasing the gears. He saw the dust first. He wiped his hands on an oily rag and dropped his wrench. He stood up straight, his eyes narrowing against the morning sun. Nora was on the porch, shaking out a rug. She stopped. The rug hung limp in her hands. She knew that buggy. Every rancher in a 50-mile radius knew that buggy. It was the harbinger of bad news, the vulture circling the dying herd. It was Dale Garrett. Garrett was the manager of the First Lone Star Bank in Alpine. He was also the biggest land buyer in the county. He didn't build ranches. He bought them for pennies when families starved, and then he leased the grass out to the northern syndicates. He was a man who measured human life in columns of ink, red and black. The carriage pulled into the yard. The horses tossed their heads, their coats shining with sweat. Garrett stepped down. He was a man in his early 50s, impeccably dressed, a gray pinstripe suit, a silver pocket watch chain draped across his vest, a crisp white collar that looked ridiculous out here in the dust. His eyes were pale blue, cold, like a frozen lake. He didn't look at Colt. He didn't look at the barn or the cattle. He looked right at Nora. "Mrs. Callahan," Garrett said. He tipped his hat. A polite gesture completely devoid of respect. "A good morning to you." Nora dropped the rug. She wiped her hands on her apron. She didn't invite him in. "Mr. Garrett," Nora said. Her voice was flat. "To what do I owe the visit? The interest payment isn't due for another 2 weeks. I have the money." Garrett smiled. It was a thin, bloodless thing. He reached into his leather satchel and pulled out a thick folder of papers. "I'm not here about the interest, Nora," he said, stepping up onto the porch. He used her first name, a deliberate lack of boundaries. "May we sit?" He didn't wait for an answer. He walked past her and sat down at the small table on the porch, the very same table where Colt had left the flour and salt pork. Colt walked up to the porch. He didn't step onto it. He just stood at the bottom of the stairs, leaning against the post, his thumbs hooked in his belt, watching. Garrett glanced at Colt. A momentary flicker of annoyance. "One of your hired hands, Nora? I thought we agreed you were cutting expenses." "He's a friend," Nora said sharply. She walked over and stood opposite Garrett. She didn't sit. "State your business, Dale." Garrett sighed. He opened the folder. He pulled out a pair of reading glasses and perched them on his nose. "I'm here as a courtesy, Nora, as a friend of your late husband," Garrett began. The lie was so smooth it almost sounded practiced. "I've been reviewing your file. The bank board had a meeting yesterday." Nora's stomach dropped. The hollow ghost was back, clawing at her ribs. "You owe $47,000 on the principal," Garrett said, tapping a manicured finger on the ledger page. "The interest payment you plan to make next week only covers the penalty for the late payment from last winter. You are effectively making no dent in the debt." "I have $80 for this month," Nora insisted. "I sold some steers. I can make the payment." "It's not enough, my dear," Garrett said patronizingly. "The board has decided to call in the loan. We are giving you a 30-day notice. Unless you can produce the full $47,000 by the 1st of next month, we will be forced to foreclose." The world stopped spinning. 30 days. $47,000. She might as well try to pull the moon out of the sky. "You can't do that," Nora said. Her voice shook. "The contract says—" "The contract," Garrett interrupted, holding up a finger, "contains a clause for early call-in if the property value drops below the loan amount. Your herds are depleted, your fences are rotting. The ranch is failing, Nora. We are simply mitigating our losses." He took off his glasses. He looked at her with feigned pity. "I am trying to help you," Garrett said smoothly. "If we foreclose, you lose everything. You walk away with the clothes on your back. But if you sign the deed over to me privately today, I will personally clear the bank debt. I will even give you $1,000 cash, enough to buy a train ticket to Dallas." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Be reasonable, Nora. A woman shouldn't be out here alone. It's unnatural. There are factory jobs in the city. Sewing, laundry, suitable work for a widow. You can put your boy in a school. Let the men handle the land." Nora stared at him, the sheer audacity of it, the calculated cruelty wrapped in polite concern. He was trying to steal her home, and he expected her to thank him for it. She felt a hot, burning rage rising in her chest. But before she could speak, a heavy boot stepped onto the porch. Colt walked up. He didn't look angry. He looked deadly calm. That was worse. He walked right up to the table. He reached out and closed Garrett's folder. He didn't slam it. He just shut it. Firmly. Garrett looked up, outraged. "See here, you're done talking," Colt said. "I am conducting bank business with the property owner," Garrett snapped, his face flushing red. "No," Nora said. Her voice rang out, clear, unshaking. Garrett looked at her. Nora placed her hands flat on the table. She leaned in. She let the union nurse take over, the woman who had stared down death and didn't blink. "You listen to me very carefully, Mr. Garrett," Nora said, her words slicing through the air. "I am not signing your papers, I am not taking your $1,000, and I am certainly not going to a sweatshop in Dallas." "Nora, you are being hysterical." "I am being educated," Nora fired back, cutting him off completely. She stood up straight. Her eyes burned with a fierce, undeniable light. "Let me make something explicitly clear to you," Nora declared. "A woman's worth is not decided by a bank's ledger, and her place in this world is not dictated by men who think they own the earth just because they hold the paper." Garrett scoffed. "Ideals won't pay your debts." "This isn't about ideals, it's about fundamental human rights," Nora stated, her voice echoing off the porch roof. "I bled for this land alongside my husband. I buried him in it. The work of my hands is just as valuable as the ink in your pen. You try to reduce me to a helpless widow, because it makes stealing from me easier for your conscience. But I am not helpless, and I am not leaving." Colt looked at Nora. A profound, deep respect settled into his features. He turned his gaze back to Garrett. "You heard the lady," Colt said. Garrett stood up. He snatched his folder from the table. His polite mask had completely vanished. He looked ugly, mean. "You are a fool, Nora," Garrett spat. "You are letting pride write checks your reality can't cash. 30 days. The sheriff will be here on the 1st of the month. He will throw you and your brats out into the dirt." He looked at Colt. "And you, Drifter, you're backing a dead horse. When the sheriff comes, you'd best be in another county. We don't take kindly to vagrants interfering with the law." Colt didn't blink. "The law is a piece of paper. Right and wrong is a different thing entirely. You're confusing capitalism with decency, Garrett. A system that builds its wealth by crushing a family in their darkest hour isn't civilization. It's just organized robbery. Colt leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous gravel. You bring the sheriff in 30 days. But you make sure you come with him. I'd like to see you look this woman in the eye when you try to steal her home. Garrett adjusted his coat. His hands were trembling slightly. He turned on his heel, walked down the steps, and climbed into his carriage. He whipped the horses hard. The carriage tore out of the yard, leaving a thick cloud of dust in its wake. They stood on the porch, watching the buggy disappear. The silence rushed back in, heavy, suffocating. 30 days. Nora's hands began to shake. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the stark, terrifying reality of what she had just done. She had just declared war on the most powerful man in the county. She grabbed the porch rail to steady herself. Her knees felt weak. Colt stepped up beside her. He didn't try to hold her up. He didn't tell her it was going to be all right. He didn't make empty promises. He just looked out at the dust settling on the road. 30 days, Colt said quietly. I don't have the money, Colt, Nora whispered, the fear finally bleeding into her voice. I don't have it. Colt turned to her. He took off his hat. Then we have 30 days to find it, he said. It wasn't a comfort. It was a battle cry. The winter verdict had been handed down, but the cowboy at her table had just refused to accept it. The heat broke on a Tuesday. It didn't cool down. It just stopped pressing and started baking. The air tasted like copper. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, empty of clouds and empty of mercy. Colt was out on the far ridge, fixing wire. Nora was in the kitchen, boiling down the last of the salted pork bones for broth. Luke was on the barn roof. He shouldn't have been up there. Nora had told him to wait. The cedar shingles were old, brittle as peanut shells. But the boy was 14. 14 is a dangerous age out on the prairie. It's the age where a boy looks at a man like Colt Wilder and decides he needs to prove he isn't a child anymore. Luke had a hammer shoved into his belt, a handful of iron nails in his pocket. He was trying to patch a hole near the weather vane. Then came the sound, a sharp, violent crack of rotting wood giving way. Then a shout, high and panicked. Then a sickening thud. Nora dropped her wooden spoon. The broth boiled over, hissing against the hot iron stove. She didn't notice. She was out the back door before the screen slammed shut. Colt heard it from the ridge. He dropped his fencing pliers. He swung up onto his roan without grabbing the stirrup, kicking the horse into a dead gallop. Nora reached him first. Luke was lying in the dirt near the barn doors. A cloud of fine brown dust was just starting to settle over him. He was curled on his side, unmoving. "Luke!" Nora screamed. She hit the dirt beside him, tearing at the knees of her dress. Blood. There was so much blood. It was pooling in the dust, turning the pale dirt a dark, rusted red. It was coming from a gash on the side of his head, a bad one. The scalp bleeds heavy, but this was deep. And his arm. His left arm was twisted back, an unnatural, terrifying angle. The shoulder was completely out of the socket. The bone pushed against the skin like it was trying to punch through. Colt's horse slid to a halt. The cowboy threw himself out of the saddle. He ran to the boy. He saw the blood, the twisted limb, the pale, waxy look of the kid's face. Colt froze. The wind seemed to stop. The smell of the blood hit his nose, and suddenly he wasn't in Texas. He was in Virginia. 1864. The smoke, the screaming. The men blown to pieces in the mud. The sheer, overwhelming helplessness of watching a life pour out into the dirt and knowing your hands couldn't stop it. His chest seized. He couldn't breathe. The big, tough cowboy who had stared down Dale Garrett without a flinch was paralyzed by the sight of a broken boy. Colt. The voice cut through the noise in his head. Sharp. Cold as a frozen lake. Colt blinked. Nora wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming anymore. The terrified mother was gone. Someone else had taken her place. She was kneeling over Luke. Her hands were moving rapidly but with absolute precision. She had already ripped the hem off her apron and had it pressed tight against the head wound. "Colt, look at me." He looked at her. Her eyes were dark, focused, and completely devoid of panic. "I need my sewing kit from the top drawer of the bureau," Nora ordered. Her voice clipped. Professional. "I need the bottle of whiskey from the top shelf of the pantry, and I need a bucket of clean water. Run." Colt didn't argue. He ran. When he got back, Nora had dragged Luke into the shade of the barn. The boy was groaning now, coming to. His eyes rolled back in his head. "Ma," Luke choked out. "Ma, it hurts." "I know it does, baby," Nora said, but she didn't coddle him. She didn't cradle his head and weep. She took the whiskey bottle from Colt. She pulled the cork out with her teeth. She poured a heavy splash directly onto the open head wound. Luke screamed, a raw, ragged sound. Nora didn't flinch. She handed the bottle to Colt. "Pour it on my hands." Colt did. The strong smell of alcohol filled the hot air. "Thread the needle," Nora commanded. Colt fumbled. His big hands were shaking, but he got the thick cotton thread through the eye of the steel needle. He handed it to her. Nora leaned over her son. "Hold his head steady, Colt. Don't let him jerk." Colt knelt in the dirt. He placed his large hands on the sides of Luke's head, holding him firm. Nora went to work. She didn't hesitate. She drove the needle through the torn flesh of the scalp, pulled it tight, tied a knot. She moved with a speed and rhythm that was breathtaking to watch. 1 stitch, 2, 3, 4. She was sealing the wound, stopping the bleeding. Her hands never shook, not once. "Okay," Nora said, snipping the thread with her teeth. "The head is fine, now the shoulder." Luke was panting, sweating. The pain was making him delirious. "Don't touch it, Ma, please." "Luke, look right into my eyes." The boy forced his eyes open. He looked at his mother. "It's out of the socket," Nora said. Calm, factual. "The longer it stays out, the more the muscle spasms, the harder it is to put back. I'm going to reset it. It is going to feel like fire. But it will be over in 1 second. Do you trust me?" Luke stared at her. He had never seen his mother like this. She looked like a general on a battlefield. He gave a tiny nod. Nora moved down to his side. She placed her bare foot against Luke's ribs right near his armpit for leverage. She gripped his wrist and his forearm with both hands. "On 3, Nora said. She looked up at Colt. "Hold his legs." Colt threw his weight over the boy's shins. "1, Nora said. She didn't say 2. She pulled hard, twisting the arm outward and then shoving it forcefully upward. Pop! A loud, sickening crack echoed in the barn. Luke screamed again, his body going completely rigid. Then, instantly, he went limp. He passed out from the shock, but the shoulder was back in place. The skin laid flat. The unnatural angle was gone. Nora sat back on her heels. She wiped her bloody hands on her dress. She took a deep breath. Slowly, the ice in her eyes began to melt. The general faded. The mother returned. She reached out and gently stroked Luke's hair. Colt sat back in the dirt. He was breathing hard. He looked at the stitches, perfect, tight little black X's across the scalp. He looked at the shoulder, flawlessly reset. He looked at Nora. "You didn't learn that mending socks," Colt said quietly. Nora didn't look up. "Help me get him inside." They carried the boy into the house, put him in his bed. Nora sat beside him with a cool, damp cloth, wiping the sweat from his face until his breathing steadied, until the color started to creep back into his pale cheeks. It was near sundown when she finally walked out onto the back porch. Colt was at the pump, washing Luke's blood off his hands. The water ran pink into the dirt. He shut off the pump. He grabbed a towel. He turned and leaned against the wooden post, looking at her. "You didn't panic," Colt said, "not for a second. You moved like a soldier under fire, better than most doctors I saw in the cavalry." Nora crossed her arms. She looked out at the darkening prairie. "I was a nurse," Nora said. Her voice was quiet in the evening air. "Field hospital, 3rd Division, Union Army, mostly stationed out of a tent near Shiloh and later down near Vicksburg. Colt's eyebrows rose. He let out a low whistle. Vicksburg. That was a meat grinder. You were cutting off legs and digging out meanie balls. Hundreds of them, Nora said softly. I learned to do it fast. You do it fast, or they die screaming. Colt dried his hands. He tossed the towel over the rail. You're down here in Texas, Colt said, putting the pieces together. Your husband was a Southern boy. You're a Yankee nurse living surrounded by folks who lost brothers and sons to the men you patched up. Nora nodded. James knew. He didn't care. But when we moved here, he asked me not to talk about it. Said it would make the neighbors angry. Make us targets. So you hid it, Colt said. You pretended to be just another helpless housewife. You let them talk down to you. You let the town women think you didn't know how to do anything but bake bread. It was easier, Nora said, looking down at her hands. Easier for who? Colt asked. Nora looked up. Colt wasn't judging her. He was genuinely asking. He was looking at her like she was the most formidable thing he had ever seen on two legs. Nora stood up straighter. The evening wind pulled at her hair. Because this world loves to punish women who dare to be too smart or too capable, Colt, Nora said. Her voice rang out clear and sharp. She wasn't whispering anymore. They tell us our minds are fragile, our nerves are weak. They tell us our place is in the parlor, not the surgical tent. And if you show them otherwise, if you show a man that your hands are just as steady as his, that your mind is just as sharp, they don't admire you. They resent you. She walked down the steps, standing level with him. I hid my skills because I wanted peace. I wanted to fit into the little box they built for widows out here. But I was wrong. She pointed back toward the house. Look what happened today. My son could have bled to death while I played the part of a fainting flower. She looked Colt dead in the eye. The words came from the very bottom of her soul. Hiding my own strength just to make other people's prejudices comfortable is an insult to the life I've lived, Nora declared. It is an insult to every soldier I saved. I am a healer. I have pulled men back from the edge of the grave, and I have every right to be proud of it. I will never ever apologize for being capable again. Colt stood perfectly still. He didn't just hear the words, he felt them. They hit him like a physical blow. He slowly reached up and tipped his hat to her. It wasn't a polite, casual gesture. It was a salute, deep, absolute. No, ma'am, Colt said softly. You shouldn't. They stood there as the sun finally dropped below the horizon. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple. Nora Callahan hadn't just saved her son's life today. She had dug up her own buried ghost, looked it in the face, and claimed it as her own. The helpless widow was dead, the field nurse had returned, and they were going to need her, because the real storm hadn't even started yet. The sky didn't get dark. It got sick. 3 days after Luke's fall, the horizon turned a bruised, unnatural shade of green. The air went dead still. The birds stopped singing. Even the crickets shut up. The cattle in the pens huddled close together, their heads low, instinctively bracing for something violent. A Texas thunderstorm wasn't just weather. It was a reckoning. Get the horses in, Colt yelled over the sudden shrieking wind. He was running across the yard, dragging 2 panicked geldings by their halters. The dust was whipping up in blinding sheets. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in 5 minutes. Nora was right behind him, carrying a lantern that swung wildly in her hand. She had locked Luke and Addie inside the house, wrapping the windows in heavy wool blankets. They reached the barn just as the sky ripped open. It wasn't rain at first, it was hail. Ice the size of musket balls hammering down on the corrugated tin roof. The noise was deafening. A continuous roaring train bearing down on them from above. Colt shoved the heavy wooden doors shut. He dropped the iron crossbar into place. They stood in the center of the barn, panting, covered in dust and sweat. The lanterns cast long, nervous shadows. We're stuck, Colt yelled over the roar of the roof. It's going to blow hard for an hour at least. Nora nodded. She walked over to the horse stalls, speaking softly to the terrified animals, running her capable hands over their necks to settle them. Then someone pounded on the barn door. It was a frantic, desperate hammering. Someone outside was screaming to get in. Colt drew his revolver. Instinct. He walked to the door, lifted the iron bar with one hand, and pulled the heavy wood back just a crack. A man fell through the gap, tumbling into the hay and dirt. He was soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably. He wore a city suit that was now plastered to his skin with mud. He looked terrified. It was a rider, a clerk from Alpine. Colt slammed the door shut and barred it again. He holstered his gun. "What are you doing out in this?" Colt demanded, grabbing the man by the collar and hauling him to his feet. The clerk wiped the mud from his eyes. He recognized Nora standing near the stalls. His hands were shaking violently as he reached inside his ruined coat and pulled out an oilskin pouch. I was sent by Mr. Garrett," the clerk stammered, his teeth chattering. "He paid me an extra $5 to ride out today. He said it couldn't wait, said he wanted you to have plenty of time to pack." Nora stepped forward. The blood ran cold in her veins. "Give it to me," she said. The clerk handed her the oilskin pouch. Nora opened it. Her hands were perfectly steady. The nurse was still in charge. She pulled out a thick sheet of heavy legal paper. The ink was protected by the pouch. It was perfectly legible. Nora walked closer to the lantern hanging on the center post. Colt watched her. He saw her eyes scan the page. He saw her pupils dilate. He saw the exact moment the field nurse died, and the grieving widow returned. Nora dropped the paper. It fluttered to the dirt floor. Her hands went to her mouth. A small, broken sound escaped her throat. It wasn't a scream. It was a whimper, the sound of an animal caught in a steel trap. "Nora?" Colt stepped forward. Nora backed away. She backed into the stall gate. She looked like she had been shot. Colt picked up the paper. He read it. It was an intent-to-sell contract, binding, legal, signed, and notarized. It stated that the owner of the Callahan Ranch agreed to transfer the deed, the cattle, and all water rights to Dale Garrett for the sum of $3,000, a fraction of what it was worth, pennies on the dollar. And there, at the bottom of the page, in dark, slashing ink, was the signature. James Callahan, dated exactly 3 weeks before his death. "He sold us," Nora whispered. Her voice was entirely hollow, stripped of all the strength she had found just days ago. Colt looked at the paper, then at her. "Nora, wait! He sold us out!" Nora gasped, her chest heaving. She grabbed her hair, pulling it tight. "He went to Garrett, behind my back. He signed the ranch away for pennies. He was going to take the money and leave. He was going to abandon me, abandon the children." The tears came then, not quiet ones. Violent, racking sobs that shook her entire body. And when he realized what he had done, when he realized the coward he was, he took his own life, Nora cried, sliding down the stall gate until she hit the dirt floor. "He didn't die because the debt was too heavy. He died because he was a traitor, and I have spent 14 months blaming myself." The thunder crashed outside, shaking the very earth beneath them. Colt stood frozen, holding the paper. He looked at the broken woman on the floor. He looked at the signature. He sold his family out. The words echoed in Colt's mind, but they weren't about James anymore. They were about him. Colt's vision tunneled. The barn faded. He was back in Montana, standing in the living room, holding a foreclosure notice, looking at his wife, Sandra, as she packed a suitcase for their son. "You ruined us, Colt." That's what she had said. "You couldn't face the world, so you destroyed ours." Colt dropped the paper. His hands began to shake. He couldn't breathe. The panic rose in his chest, hot and suffocating. This was it. This was the curse. It didn't matter how hard he worked. It didn't matter how many fences he fixed or water pumps he rebuilt. He was a magnet for ruin. Every family he touched turned to ash. He had broken his own, and now, standing here, he felt like he was somehow responsible for breaking hers. He couldn't fight a ghost. He couldn't fight a legal document signed by a dead man. Colt backed away. "Colt?" Nora looked up through her tears. She saw the terror in his eyes. "Colt, what is it?" "I can't," Colt choked out. He stumbled back toward the tack room. "I can't fix this, Nora." "I'm not asking you to fix it," Nora cried out. "I just need you here. "I'm bad luck," Colt yelled, his voice cracking. The cavalry soldier was gone. The brave cowboy was gone. There was just a broken man terrified of his own shadow. He grabbed his saddlebags off the wooden peg. He started shoving his few belongings inside. A spare shirt, a tin cup, a box of cartridges. "Everywhere I go, things fall apart," Colt said, his breathing ragged. He wouldn't look at her. He couldn't. "I'm a jinx, Nora, a drifter. I tried to stay. I tried to play house, but I'm just poison. You're losing everything, and I'm just standing here making it worse." Nora forced herself up from the dirt. She stumbled toward him. "That is a lie. You saved Luke. You saved the cattle." "I can't save you from him," Colt roared, pointing at the piece of paper on the floor. "He's dead, and he still beat you. He beat me. I can't fight a dead man's ink." He threw his saddlebags over his shoulder. He walked past her. He didn't touch her. He didn't offer a hand. He walked to the back of the barn, to the small lean-to where he kept his roan. He opened the stall. He threw the bags over the horse's back. "Colt, please," Nora begged. The strongest woman in Texas was reduced to pleading in the dirt. "Don't leave me alone in the dark." Colt stopped. His back was to her. His shoulders shook. "You were already alone, Nora," he whispered into the storm. "I was just a ghost haunting your barn." He didn't walk out into the rain. It was suicide to ride in a hailstorm. But he didn't stay in the main barn. He led his horse into the small, cramped lean-to shed attached to the back. He pulled the heavy wooden sliding door shut between them, locking it from his side. The sound of the latch sliding home was louder than the thunder. Nora stood in the center of the massive, empty barn. The clerk was huddled in a corner, too terrified to speak. Nora looked down at the piece of paper. The intent to sell, the betrayal. She was entirely, completely alone. She fell to her knees in the hay. The storm raged outside, tearing at the roof, howling through the cracks in the wood. But it was nothing compared to the storm inside her chest. She curled into a ball on the dirt floor, closed her eyes, and let the darkness take her. It was the darkest night of her life. And the cowboy had not stayed at the table. He had run. The storm broke just before dawn. It left behind a world made of mud and shattered wood. The air smelled like crushed sage and wet dirt. Cold, bitter cold. Nora woke up on the floor of the barn. Her muscles were stiff. Her dress was damp. She sat up slowly. The hay scratched her palms. She looked at the spot where the paper had fallen. The intent to sell. It was still there, curled at the edges from the dampness. She didn't cry. The tears were gone, burned out of her. What replaced them was something entirely different. It was a cold, hard ember sitting dead center in her chest. She stood up. She brushed the dirt from her skirt. She walked over to the lean-to. The heavy wooden door was still shut, locked from the inside. Colt was in there, hiding, running from the ghosts he couldn't shoot. Nora didn't knock. She didn't beg. She turned around and walked out into the mud. The yard was a wreck, fences down, troughs overflowing. She ignored it all. She walked straight to the corral, grabbed a bridle, and threw it over the big gray gelding. She didn't bother with a saddle. She just hopped onto his bare back, gripping the mane. She kicked the horse hard. They tore out of the yard, mud flying up behind the hooves. Alpine was a ghost town when she arrived. The streets were rivers of brown sludge. The boardwalks were slick. She didn't go to the bank. She went to the doctor's office. Old Doc Miller was sitting on his porch, drinking bitter coffee. He looked up, surprised to see a woman riding bareback, her hair wild, her dress caked in mud. Nora slid off the horse. She marched up the steps. "Nora," Doc Miller started, standing up. "What in heaven's name—" "My husband," Nora interrupted. Her voice was like cracked glass. "James, he came to see you before he died." It wasn't a question. Doc Miller looked away. He set his coffee cup down. His hands were shaking. "Nora, doctor-patient confidentiality. I can't." "He's dead, Henry," Nora snapped. She stepped closer. "And his ghost is about to let Dale Garrett steal my farm. I need to know. What was wrong with him?" The old doctor looked at her. He saw the sheer, unbending will in her eyes. The nurse, the soldier, he sighed. A long, defeated sound. He walked into his office. Nora followed. He opened a heavy oak filing cabinet. He pulled out a thin manila folder. He didn't hand it to her. He just laid it on the desk. "Consumption," Doc Miller said quietly. Nora stopped. The breath left her lungs. "Tuberculosis," Doc Miller continued, tapping the file. "Late stage. It was in his bones, Nora. He was coughing blood for months. He made me swear not to tell you. He said you had enough to worry about with the drought and the bank." Nora stared at the file. The words swam on the page. "He didn't kill himself," Doc Miller said softly. "The fever took him. He died in his sleep. His heart just gave out from the strain." Nora touched the paper. Her fingers traced James's name. "The farm," Nora whispered. "He signed a paper to sell the farm to Garrett just weeks before." Doc Miller nodded slowly. "He knew he was dying. He knew the debt would crush you. He thought if he sold to Garrett quietly, he could leave you a pile of cash, enough to pack up the kids and move back east. He was trying to save you, Nora." The silence in the room was absolute. He didn't hate her. He didn't abandon her. He was just a terrified man, dying in secret, trying to fix a broken world the only way he knew how. "Why?" Nora asked. Her voice cracked. "Why didn't he just tell me he was sick?" Doc Miller looked out the window. "Because of pride, Nora. The men out here, they think suffering in silence is the measure of a man. They think letting their wives see them weak is a sin." Nora closed her eyes. The tragedy of it, the stupid, senseless, heartbreaking tragedy of it. He didn't die of debt. He died of silence. Nora opened her eyes. The ember in her chest flared into a roaring fire. She grabbed the medical file. "I'm taking this," she said. She didn't wait for permission. She walked out, got on her horse, and rode hard. When she got back to the ranch, the sun was high. The mud was starting to bake. Colt was in the yard. His horse was saddled. His bedroll was tied tight. He had his foot in the stirrup. Nora slid off the gray gelding. She didn't slow down. She marched right across the muddy yard. Colt swung his leg over the saddle. He pulled the reins, turning the roan toward the open road. He wouldn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon. Nora stepped right in front of the horse. The roan snorted and tossed its head. Colt pulled back on the reins, stopping the animal inches from Nora's chest. "Move, Nora," Colt said. His voice was hoarse, thick with guilt. Nora reached up. She grabbed the leather bridle, hard. "Get down," she ordered. "I told you," Colt said, looking down at his saddle horn. "I'm poison. I'm leaving before I ruin anything else." "You arrogant fool," Nora fired back. Her voice echoed off the barn walls. Colt's head snapped up. Nora glared at him. Her eyes were burning. "You think this is about you?" Nora demanded. "You think my husband dying is about your bad luck? James didn't kill himself. He died of tuberculosis." Colt froze. The breath caught in his throat. "He was dying," Nora said, her voice shaking with rage and grief. "He tried to sell the land to leave us cash to run away. He did it all in secret, because he thought being a man meant hiding his weakness from the woman who loved him." She yanked on the bridle, pulling the horse's head down. "And now look at you," Nora spat, "doing the exact same thing, running away, hiding your fear because you think it makes you noble." Colt swallowed hard. "I'm trying to protect you." "That is a lie," Nora shouted. The words ripped through the quiet yard. Nora didn't let up. She stood her ground. She looked right into the eyes of the deadliest man she had ever met, and she didn't blink. "Listen to me, Colt Wilder," Nora said, her voice dropping into a fierce, unwavering command. "Do you really think riding away protects us? Do you think leaving me here alone is honorable? That's cowardice." Colt gripped the saddle horn until his knuckles turned white. "Running doesn't make you a better man," Nora declared. stating it so clearly the wind seemed to stop and listen. Respecting someone doesn't mean bailing the second the wind blows hard and you get scared. Respect means planting your boots in the dirt. It means looking at each other's wounds, no matter how ugly they are, and fixing them together. She let go of the bridle. She took one step back. "If you see me as a weak, helpless widow, then keep riding," Nora said. "But if you see me as an equal human being, if you believe that a man and a woman are supposed to fight side by side, then you step down off that horse, you stay, and you fight beside me." She stood there in the mud, breath heaving, waiting. Colt looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the mud on her dress, the wild hair, the sheer, terrifying strength radiating from her bones. She wasn't asking to be saved. She was asking for a partner. Slowly, Colt took his boot out of the stirrup. He swung his leg over. He dropped down into the mud. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He reached up, untied his bedroll, and let it fall to the dirt. He was staying. The courthouse in Alpine was a hot, stuffy room that smelled of stale tobacco and old wood. Judge Parker sat behind a high oak desk. He was a stern man, fair but completely unsentimental. Dale Garrett sat at a table to the right. He looked incredibly smug. His expensive suit was pressed. His silver pocket watch gleamed in the sunlight filtering through the dirty windows. Nora sat to the left. Colt stood right behind her chair, a silent, immovable mountain. "Mrs. Callahan," Judge Parker said, peering over his spectacles, "Mr. Garrett has presented a signed, notarized contract, an intent to sell. The signature appears genuine. The terms, while ungenerous, are legally binding." Garrett smiled. He leaned back in his chair. "It's a simple matter of law, Your Honor. The bank will take possession of the property at noon tomorrow." Nora stood up. She didn't look at Garrett. She looked at the judge. She reached into her canvas bag. She pulled out the manila folder. She walked forward and laid it on the judge's desk. "That is the medical file of James Callahan," Nora said. Her voice was calm, steady. "Provided and authenticated by Dr. Henry Miller of this town." Judge Parker frowned. He opened the folder. "Your Honor," Nora continued, speaking clearly so everyone in the room could hear, "a contract is only valid if the signatory is of sound mind and body. Is that correct?" "It is," the judge murmured, his eyes scanning the doctor's notes. "Read the entry dated October 4th, Nora instructed, 3 days before that contract was signed." Judge Parker adjusted his glasses. He read aloud. "Patient presence with advanced stage consumption, fever of 104 degrees, severe delirium. Patient cannot distinguish night from day. Judgment entirely impaired." Garrett sat up straight. The smug smile vanished. "Now see here, that is hearsay." "That is medical fact, Mr. Garrett," the judge interrupted, giving the banker a sharp look. Nora turned to look at Garrett. "My husband did not know what he was signing. He was burning alive from the inside out. He was desperate and delirious. You took advantage of a dying man." The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Parker closed the file. He tapped his gavel once. "The intent to sell is hereby voided," the judge declared. "A signature obtained from a man in the throes of a tubercular fever holds no weight in my court." Garrett's face turned an ugly shade of purple. He stood up, slamming his hand on the table. "Fine," Garrett barked. "The private sale is void. But the debt remains, Mrs. Callahan. You owe the First Lone Star Bank $47,000. You still have no money. The bank will foreclose on the original loan." He pointed a shaking finger at her. "I'll still have your land by the end of the week." Nora didn't flinch. She just reached into her canvas bag one more time. She pulled out a second document. Crisp, official. It had a heavy wax seal at the bottom. "When Doc Miller gave me the medical file," Nora said smoothly, "he also gave me this. James left it in his care, to be given to me after the dust settled." She placed it on the judge's desk. "It is a life insurance policy," Nora stated, "issued by the New York Mutual Company, for the sum of $50,000. Garrett laughed, a harsh barking sound. Insurance policies do not pay out on suicides, Nora. Read the fine print. I did, Nora said. She looked up at the judge. Your Honor, as established by the medical records you hold in your hand, James Callahan did not commit suicide. He died of natural causes, tuberculosis, heart failure. The policy is entirely valid. Garrett stopped laughing. The color drained from his face entirely. Judge Parker inspected the document. He nodded slowly. A rare, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. The policy is sound, Judge Parker announced. And since Mr. Garrett is the acting manager of the bank, we can settle this right now. Nora turned to Garrett. You'll get your $47,000, Dale, Nora said. Her voice was ice. And you will never, ever step foot on my land again. It was over. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon. The sky was clear. The air was finally cooling down. Nora felt light. For the first time in over a year, the crushing weight was gone. The farm was hers. The children were safe. The ghost of James was finally laid to rest with the truth. When they walked into the farmhouse, the kitchen was quiet. Luke and Addie were out in the yard feeding the chickens. Nora set her bag on the counter. She took off her hat. She ran a hand through her hair. Colt stood by the door. He took his hat off, spinning it slowly in his hands. You did it, Colt said softly. We did it, Nora corrected. She turned to face him. If you hadn't stayed, if you hadn't pushed me, I would have given up in that barn. Colt shook his head. No, you wouldn't have. You're the strongest thing I've ever seen, Nora. He walked further into the kitchen. He stopped by the wooden table. The same table he had sat down at weeks ago. He reached out and traced the edge of the wood with his finger. A true partnership isn't about one person saving the other, Nora, Colt said, looking up at her. He spoke the words like a vow. It's not a strong man rescuing a weak woman. It's about standing side by side. It's about knowing that when your knees buckle, the person next to you is going to catch you, not because they pity you, because they respect you. Nora walked toward him. Her heart was beating a steady, heavy rhythm in her chest. I know, Nora whispered. She stopped right in front of him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his chest, close enough to smell the leather and the tobacco and the dust. Colt looked down at her. His eyes were dark, deep. All the walls were gone, all the running was over. He didn't grab her, he didn't pull her to him. He just raised one rough, calloused hand and gently cupped her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. Nora leaned into his touch. She let her eyes flutter shut for just a second. Then she looked up. Colt leaned down. It wasn't a desperate kiss. It wasn't rushed. It was slow, deep, grounding. It was the kiss of two people who had survived the fire and found themselves still standing in the ashes. It tasted like tears and relief, and the absolute certainty of a new beginning. When they pulled apart, Colt rested his forehead against hers. I'm staying, Nora, Colt whispered. I know, she smiled. You sat down at my table. You don't get to leave now. A year passed. It was spring 1879. Texas didn't just turn green. It exploded into color. The blue bonnets carpeted the prairie in a sea of vibrant indigo. The creeks ran high and cold. The cattle in the pens were thick with muscle and fat. The Callahan Wilder Ranch was alive. The wedding didn't happen in a church. It happened right on the front porch. There was no organ music, no lace veil. Nora wore a simple, beautiful dress of dark blue cotton. Colt wore a clean white shirt, a black vest, and his best boots, polished until they shone. Judge Parker rode out from Alpine to perform the ceremony. There were only a dozen people there. Neighbors who had once whispered behind Nora's back now stood in her yard with their hats in their hands, looking at her with undeniable respect. Luke stood beside Colt. The boy had shot up 3 inches in a year. His shoulder was fully healed. He looked like a young man now, proud and tall. Addie stood holding her mother's hand, beaming a smile that could outshine the Texas sun. Do you, Colt Wilder, take this woman? Judge Parker asked. Colt looked at Nora. I do, with all that I am. And do you, Nora Callahan, take this man? Nora squeezed Addie's hand. She looked at the cowboy who had refused to let her starve. I do, Nora said clearly. The judge smiled. By the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. The small crowd clapped. Colt kissed her, sweet and brief. But as the clapping died down, the sound of an approaching horse made them turn. A rider was coming up the long dirt driveway, a young man, tall, broad-shouldered, riding a sturdy roan that looked an awful lot like Colt's. Colt stepped down from the porch, his breath caught. The young man pulled back on the reins. He slid off the horse. He took his hat off. It was Tommy. He had made the journey all the way from Montana. Colt took a step forward, then another. He didn't know what to do. The guilt of 5 years of absence threatened to swallow him whole. But Tommy didn't look angry. He just looked like a boy who had finally found his father. Tommy walked forward. He stuck his hand out. "It's good to see you, Pa," Tommy said. His voice cracked just a little. Colt looked at the hand. Then he looked at his son. He didn't shake the hand. He grabbed the boy by the shoulders and pulled him into a crushing hug. Tommy hugged him back. Nora watched from the porch, tears of absolute joy blurring her vision. The healing was complete. The circle was closed. 3 years later. The sign hanging over the main gate read, Callahan Wilder Ranch, carved deep into the oak by Luke's own hands. But the ranch wasn't just a cattle operation anymore. The large front parlor of the farmhouse had been transformed. There were wooden benches lining the walls, a glass cabinet filled with tinctures, bandages, and surgical tools. It was a clinic. Nora was standing by a wooden examination table. She was washing her hands in a porcelain basin. Sitting on the bench was a local white rancher with a badly cut hand. Sitting right next to him was a young Comanche woman holding a feverish infant. In 1882, this was unheard of. It was dangerous, but Nora didn't care. The rancher glared at the Comanche woman. He shifted away from her. Nora dried her hands. She walked over. She didn't whisper. She spoke with the authority of a woman who owned the ground she stood on. "Mr. Henderson," Nora said, her voice echoing in the clinic. "In this room, pain doesn't care about the color of a man's skin. Sickness doesn't check a map to see where you were born. Every human being bleeds the exact same shade of red." She pointed to the examination table. "You will sit next to this mother and you will treat her with the exact same dignity you expect from me. Because out here we are all just fragile creatures trying to survive the dirt. If you cannot respect the humanity of the person sitting beside you, you can walk out that door and stitch your own hand." Henderson looked at the fierce woman. He looked at the floor. He swallowed his pride. "Yes, ma'am," he muttered. Nora nodded. She turned to the Comanche mother, smiling gently, and reached for the baby. Outside on the porch, Colt was sitting in the rocking chair. He was sipping a mug of black coffee. His hair had a little more gray in it now, but his face was relaxed. The haunted look was gone forever. Addie, now a tall, bright 13-year-old, burst out the screen door. "Pa, Colt!" Addie called out. "Can we take the wagon into town? I need new ribbon for my hat." Colt smiled. He took a sip of coffee. "Reckon we can, little bird. Soon as your ma is done working miracles." He looked through the open window, watching his wife work. Colt Wilder didn't save Nora Callahan. The thought wasn't a spoken word. It was the truth of the earth, the truth of the story. True love was never about the strong tossing a lifeline to the weak. It wasn't about a hero riding in to rescue a helpless victim. It is two deeply rooted trees standing in hard, dry earth, standing tall on their own dignity, but reaching out to weave their branches together so they can share the shade. In the end, the greatest thing you can ever do for another human being isn't carrying their whole world for them. It's pulling up a chair on the days they are starving the most, sitting down at their table, looking at their broken pieces, and absolutely refusing to leave. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.
As the dust settles over the quiet Texas plains, what lingers from this story is not just the struggle of survival, but the quiet, powerful truth about what it means to be human. Nora Callahan began her journey believing that strength meant enduring pain alone, that dignity required silence, and that accepting help was a form of weakness. But life, in all its harshness, revealed something deeper. True strength is not found in isolation, it is found in connection. It is found in the courage to admit when we are overwhelmed, in the humility to accept a helping hand, and in the resilience to keep going even when everything seems lost. Colt Wilder, a man burdened by his own past and haunted by his failures, believed he brought ruin wherever he went. Yet, in standing beside Nora, not above her, not saving her, but walking with her, he rediscovered something he had long forgotten, that redemption does not come from running away, but from staying, from facing the storm, not alone, but together. Their story reminds us that no one is meant to carry the weight of the world by themselves. The myth of silent suffering, especially in a world that often demands toughness over vulnerability, is one of the greatest lies we are ever taught. Perhaps the most profound lesson lies in Nora's transformation. She was never weak, only made to believe she had to hide her strength to survive in a world that underestimated her. When she finally embraced who she truly was, a healer, a fighter, a mother, she not only saved her son, but reclaimed her identity. Her journey teaches us that suppressing our abilities to fit into society's expectations is a quiet kind of self-betrayal. And when we choose to stand fully in who we are, unapologetically, we do more than survive, we begin to truly live. This story also speaks to something timeless, the power of compassion. In a land defined by hardship, where resources are scarce and life is unforgiving, kindness becomes an act of courage. Colt's decision to help, not out of obligation but out of simple human decency, changed everything. It reminds us that even the smallest act of care can alter the course of someone's life. And sometimes offering help is not about saving someone, it's about reminding them they are not alone. In the end, the lesson is simple, yet deeply meaningful. Strength and vulnerability are not opposites, they are partners. Love is not always loud or grand, sometimes it is quiet, steady, and unspoken. And survival, real survival, is not just about enduring hardship, it is about finding connection in the middle of it. Because no matter how harsh the world becomes, as long as people choose to stand together, there will always be hope.